A thick fog clung to the moors surrounding Blackwood Manor, curling around the ancient stone walls like spectral fingers. The estate loomed in the distance, its turrets piercing the night sky as the moon cast eerie shadows upon the gravel path, leading up to its heavy oak doors. Inside, the grandeur of the old mansion seemed untouched by time. Ornate chandeliers flickered with candlelight, casting long, dancing silhouettes upon the faded wallpaper. Yet, beneath its aristocratic elegance, an air of unease hung thick, as if the house itself whispered secrets to those who dared to listen. The master of the house, Lord Reginald Blackwood, had been found dead in his study. The discovery was as perplexing as it was chilling. The door had been locked from the inside, and the only key lay within the room. The windows, though large and overlooking the stormy cliffs, were bolted shut. No secret passage was known to exist. The body itself bore no obvious wounds, save for the peculiar expression frozen upon Lord Blackwood's face, an open-mouthed gasp of terror as though he had seen something unspeakable in his final moments. His eyes, wide with fear, stared at the oil portrait of his late wife, Lady Eleanor Blackwood, which hung above the grand fireplace. The most curious detail of all was the single candle that had burned to its base upon the desk. Wax had pooled and hardened in an unusual pattern, resembling the outline of a hand, as if someone, or something, had placed their palm upon the molten wax without flinching. Lady Blackwood's younger brother, Charles Wentworth, had been the one to break down the study door. He had knocked that evening, receiving no response, before hearing a sound, half a strangled cry, half a whisper. It had been enough to send a cold dread through him. With the help of the butler, Mr. Graves, he forced the door open only to be met with the ghastly sight of the dead man, seated upright in his chair, his fingers clutching at the armrests, as though bracing himself against some unseen horror. Scotland Yard had arrived swiftly, their usual efficiency dampened by the sheer impossibility of the scene. No weapon, no sign of struggle, no clear cause of death. They were baffled, and so, out of desperation, a telegram had been sent to Whitehaven Mansions, summoning the only man who might make sense of the senseless. When Hercule Poirot arrived, clad in his immaculate three-piece suit and twirling his moustache in quiet contemplation, the household gathered anxiously in the great hall. The detective's keen eyes swept over the assembled faces. Lady Blackwood, draped in black lace and clutching a handkerchief to her lips. Charles Wentworth, his jaw tight with barely contained tension. Miss Harriet Blackwood, the late lord's only daughter. Her expression a mix of sorrow and something deeper, unreadable. The servants, standing at a distance, murmuring amongst themselves about the house being cursed. Poirot wasted no time. He was ushered into the study, where Lord Blackwood's body still sat, untouched since the discovery. The detective moved with measured precision, his gaze lingering on details others had dismissed. The particular way the wax had dripped, the faint scent of something acrid lingering in the air. He knelt beside the corpse, noting the unnatural rigidity of the fingers, the slight discoloration at the lips. Then he turned to the portrait above the fireplace. Lady Eleanor Blackwood had been dead for nearly 15 years, yet there was something about the painting that struck him as oddly alive. He stepped closer, brushing a gloved finger along the frame, frowning ever so slightly. "Mon Dieu," he murmured, mostly to himself. The room held its breath. Poirot straightened, his fingertips resting against his lapels, as his sharp gaze drifted from the portrait to the silent gathering behind him. The air in the study was heavy, laden with expectation and unease. He turned back toward the desk, his hand hovering above the strange wax formation. With the delicacy of a jeweler inspecting a fine gem, he traced the edge of the hardened pool without disturbing it. "Curious," he murmured, the word hanging in the dim candlelight. "Tell me, monsieur, who was the last to see Lord Blackwood alive?" A hesitation passed through the room before Charles Wentworth cleared his throat. "I was," he admitted. "After dinner, around 8. He said he wished to be alone in his study for the evening, as he often did." Poirot tilted his head. "And he was in good spirits?" "As good as one can be," Charles replied, his lips tightening. "He wasn't a cheerful man, Monsieur Poirot, not since Eleanor's passing." Poirot nodded absently, shifting his focus to the rest of the room. "And you, Lady Blackwood?" The widow flinched at being addressed so directly. Her voice, soft and deliberate, carried the weight of years spent in quiet suffering. "I retired early," she said, "as I always do." "Alone?" Poirot's gaze was unwavering. Her fingers tightened around the handkerchief she held. "Yes." A flicker of something unreadable passed through Poirot's expression before he turned to the butler, Mr. Graves. The old servant stood stiffly near the door, his face a mask of polite detachment. "And you, mon ami, did you observe anything unusual?" Graves hesitated only a fraction before shaking his head. "No, sir. I was in the servants' quarters most of the evening." Poirot's moustache twitched. Something was amiss, though it was not yet clear what. His eyes fell upon Harriet Blackwood, who had remained silent throughout the questioning. The young woman's expression was carefully neutral, her arms crossed in a manner that suggested quiet defiance rather than grief. Poirot studied her for a moment before shifting his attention to the crime scene once more. He moved toward the fireplace, his steps precise and deliberate. His fingers brushed the edge of the mantel where a fine layer of dust had settled, everywhere except for a small, clean patch directly beneath the portrait of Lady Eleanor. Poirot's dark eyes narrowed. "Someone has touched this," he said, softly. Wentworth stepped forward. "The servants dust regularly." Non, mon ami. This has been disturbed quite recently." Poirot reached up and with a careful touch pressed against the ornate frame of the painting. A barely audible click echoed through the silent room. Slowly, ever so slightly, the portrait shifted. A draught of cold air whispered from behind the frame. The assembled onlookers drew in a collective breath as Poirot pulled the painting away, revealing a small hidden compartment embedded in the stone wall. The space was empty, save for a single item, a brass key, aged and worn, but unmistakably modern compared to the hidden recess that housed it. Poirot turned, holding the key aloft. "And what, I wonder, does this unlock?" A sharp intake of breath broke the silence. Harriet Blackwood had stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the key, a flicker of something unmistakable in her expression. Poirot saw it, recognition swiftly masked by a feigned indifference. A key left hidden behind the portrait of a dead woman, Poirot mused, slipping it into his pocket. "How interesting, n'est-ce pas?" Harriet's jaw tightened. "It's probably nothing," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Poirot's smile was faint, but his gaze held an edge of quiet amusement. "Ah, mademoiselle, but in my experience, nothing is ever just nothing." The tension in the room thickened. Poirot had cast the first stone, and now he would wait, watching, listening for the ripples to spread. Poirot turned the key over in his palm, studying its aged surface as he observed the reactions around him. Harriet's fingers curled slightly at her sides, her lips parting as if to speak before she caught herself. Lady Blackwood averted her gaze entirely, her knuckles pale where they gripped the delicate lace of her handkerchief. Charles Wentworth, however, seemed merely intrigued, his eyes darting between Poirot and the hidden compartment. "Fascinating," he murmured. "A secret within the house itself." Poirot glanced at him. "Indeed, Monsieur Wentworth. And secrets, as you must know, have a tendency to betray themselves when the time is right." He slipped the key into his pocket and stepped back from the fireplace. "But come, I should like to hear more of what each of you recalls from last night. A man does not die in such a manner without ripples forming in the waters around him." There was a silence before Charles gestured toward the chairs near the desk. "Shall we sit?" Poirot waved a hand. "No, I prefer to stand. Conversation, when taken on one's feet, moves much like the mind, more freely." The guests exchanged uncertain glances, but Poirot had already turned to Lady Blackwood. His voice, gentle yet firm, carried no room for evasion. "Madame, your husband, as you say, was not a man of great cheer. But did you suspect, even in the smallest way, that he was troubled enough to end his own life?" She inhaled sharply, her body stiffening. "End his own life," she repeated, as if the very thought were foreign. Poirot's keen eyes never wavered. "The authorities have yet to determine how Lord Blackwood met his fate, but you are his
widow, and you knew his habits well. Did he ever speak of dark thoughts?"
Her fingers trembled slightly against the handkerchief. "No," she said after a moment. "No, he was a cold man, but he valued control above all else. He would not—" She cut herself off. "Would not what, madame?" She pressed her lips together, shaking her head. "Nothing." Poirot tilted his head slightly, filing the moment away for later. He turned next to Charles. "And you, Monsieur Wentworth, your visit last night, did Lord Blackwood seem troubled?" Charles hesitated, rubbing his chin. "He was irritated, certainly. He was complaining about something. What was it? Ah, yes. He mentioned his solicitor had sent him new documents about the estate, ones he didn't like. He was muttering about changes that shouldn't have been made. I didn't press him on it. We spoke briefly, and then I left him to his solitude." "Did you hear anything after that? Perhaps a noise, voices?" Charles frowned. "No, not that I recall." Poirot hummed in thought before his gaze shifted to Harriet. She remained motionless, her face carefully composed. "Mademoiselle, you seemed quite interested in this key. Tell me, do you recognize it?" Harriet's brows furrowed in irritation. "I was surprised, that's all. A secret compartment in my own home. I had no idea it was there." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, but I did not ask about the compartment. I asked about the key." Her mouth tightened. "I don't recognize it." Poirot allowed a silence to stretch between them, just long enough for discomfort to settle. Harriet did not waver, but there was an almost imperceptible tension in her posture. He turned next to the butler. "Monsieur Graves, your role in this household is one of observation, n'est-ce pas? You move through its halls, unnoticed yet ever watchful." Graves inclined his head respectfully. "I do my duties, sir." Poirot studied him. "And last night, did your duties bring you near the study?" A hesitation. "I came near the study. Briefly," he admitted. I heard Lord Blackwood's voice from within, speaking to someone, but I do not know who. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Ah, and at what time was this? Around 9:30. This drew murmurs from the others. Charles spoke up. Then it wasn't me. I left well before then. Poirot tapped a finger against his chin. And you are certain, Monsieur Graves, that there was another voice? Graves gave a slow nod. Yes, it was quiet, but I'm certain he was not alone. Poirot observed him for a moment longer, and yet no one has admitted to seeing Lord Blackwood past 8 o'clock. He let the statement hang, watching for the subtle betrayals of expression. Harriet's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Lady Blackwood remained rigid, her gaze on the floor. Charles frowned, thoughtful but unmoved. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. It seems, mes amis, that someone here is withholding the truth. But you see, the truth, it is much like this house. He gestured to the grand aged walls around them. It has a structure, a shape that will always remain, no matter how one tries to paint over it. His eyes flicked toward Harriet once more before he turned away, pacing slowly toward the desk. Lord Blackwood was heard speaking to someone after Charles departed, but we do not yet know who. We have found a hidden key behind the portrait of his late wife, and we have, above all, a death that was meant to appear straightforward, yet is anything but. He paused, then looked over his shoulder. Tell me, does that not intrigue you as much as it does me? Silence. But it was a silence that held, weight filled with unsaid words and guarded secrets. Poirot's smile was faint. He had begun to stir the waters. Now he would watch the ripples unfold. Poirot stood in the grand yet sombre study of Blackwood Manor, his sharp eyes drifting between the assembled guests. The air was thick with unspoken words, with carefully veiled emotions lurking beneath composed expressions. He let the silence stretch, allowing tension to do its work, before he finally spoke. A man such as Lord Blackwood, wealthy, powerful, yet so very alone, invites many things into his home, does he not? Poirot's voice was measured, deliberate. Resentment, envy, secrets. He moved toward the desk, his fingers grazing its polished surface. But to truly understand his death, we must first understand his life. Each of you knew him in different ways. Each of you had a place in his world, a stake in his choices, and now, mes amis, we must untangle these threads. Lady Blackwood stiffened. You make it sound as though we are all suspects. Poirot's lips curled faintly. But of course, until the truth is known, everyone in this house is a suspect. Harriet let out a scoff, folding her arms. Then, perhaps you should start with my mother. After all, she stood to gain the most. Lady Blackwood turned sharply. How dare you? Poirot merely watched as Harriet's gaze remained cold. Father had been threatening to change his will. He spoke of it more than once. He wasn't exactly subtle about his contempt for you, was he? Lady Blackwood's face paled. He said many things when he was angry, Poirot hummed thoughtfully. And did he follow through on these threats? Did he indeed alter his will? A silence settled over the room. Lady Blackwood lowered her eyes. I don't know, she admitted. Poirot's fingers tapped lightly against the desk. Intriguing, n'est-ce pas? If Lord Blackwood had indeed changed his will, then his death could serve quite a convenient purpose for someone. His gaze flickered toward Charles Wentworth. "Tell me, Monsieur Wentworth, did Lord Blackwood mention anything of this to you?" Charles exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Not directly, but yes. I suspected he was planning something drastic. He was fuming about legal documents when I last saw him, and I wouldn't put it past him to cut people off without warning." Poirot studied him closely. "And yet you claim you did not ask about these documents. Curious, is it not? A solicitor would naturally take an interest in such matters." Charles hesitated. Look, it wasn't my place to pry." Harriet scoffed. "That's rich coming from you." Poirot tilted his head. "Mademoiselle, you imply that Monsieur Wentworth had a reason to be particularly invested in your father's finances." Harriet's lips curled. "Oh, certainly. Charles has always been eager to offer his legal advice, especially when it benefits him. And let's not forget, Father trusted him more than anyone. That kind of influence has its advantages, doesn't it, Charles?" Charles tensed. "That's absurd." Poirot let the moment stretch before shifting his focus. "And you, Mademoiselle Harriet, did you have reason to worry about your father's decisions?" She raised a brow. "You think I killed him because of money?" "Not necessarily. There are many reasons why a daughter might despise her father." Her jaw tightened. "I had no love for him, but I didn't kill him." Poirot studied her, noting the flicker of emotion beneath her sharp exterior. "No, perhaps not. But you were aware of his secrets, were you not?" Harriet's expression didn't change, but her fingers twitched slightly at her sides. Poirot caught the motion, tucking it away in his mental ledger. His gaze shifted again, this time settling on Graves, the butler who had remained a quiet observer. "And you, Monsieur Graves, you heard Lord Blackwood speaking to someone last night, did you not?" Graves gave a slow nod. "I did." Poirot's voice was calm but unwavering. "And yet no one has admitted to seeing him at that hour, which means, Monsieur, that someone here is lying." A heavy silence filled the room. Poirot let the weight of it settle before continuing. "There is a motive for each of you, Mace. Miss, Madame Blackwood, you stood to lose everything if your husband disinherited you. Monsieur Wentworth, you had the means to manipulate legal matters to your advantage. Mademoiselle Harriet, you harbored deep resentment toward your father, perhaps even hatred. And Monsieur Graves, you have served this household for years. Perhaps you knew more than you should have." His eyes flickered with sharp intensity. "The question is not whether someone had a reason. It is which reason was worth killing for." The room was thick with unease, each face caught somewhere between indignation and apprehension. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. "But fear not, the truth, it always reveals itself sooner or later." Inspector Lestrade stood before the assembled household, a triumphant gleam in his eyes as he placed a single damning object on the desk before him, a small pearl-handled revolver. "Found behind a loose panel in the victim's study," he announced, his tone carrying the certainty of a man who believed his work was done. "The same caliber as the bullet that killed Lord Blackwood. And do you know who it belongs to?" His gaze swept across the room before settling on Charles Wentworth. "Your prints are all over it." Charles blanched. "That's impossible." "I don't even own a revolver," Lestrade smirked. "And yet, here it is. You were his lawyer, his trusted confidant, the man who handled all of his legal affairs. Maybe you knew what was coming. Maybe Blackwood was going to cut you out, replace you with someone else. You had the most to lose." Poirot, who had been silent until now, gave a slight tilt of his head. A most convenient theory, mon ami, and naturellement it fits quite nicely, non? Lestrade turned to him with a smug nod. It does indeed. Poirot. Motive, opportunity, and now evidence. I don't see what more we need. Poirot's gaze lingered on the revolver. Ah, but you see, Inspector, that is precisely what troubles me. It is too neat, too perfect. Charles' face was lined with desperation. Monsieur Poirot, you must believe me. I had nothing to do with this. Someone is framing me. Poirot raised a hand for silence. That much, Monsieur Wentworth, is apparent. Lestrade frowned. Apparent? Poirot, the weapon was hidden in his study, found with his fingerprints. What more do you need? Poirot bent slightly over the revolver but did not touch it. His eyes traced its shape, the smoothness of its pearl grip, the fine engravings along the barrel. Tell me, Inspector, when was this revolver last fired? Lestrade scoffed. The coroner confirmed the bullet that killed Blackwood came from this caliber. The gun was wiped clean except for Wentworth's prints. But what more does it matter? Poirot straightened, his expression unreadable. Ah, but it matters a great deal, mon ami. The lack of gunpowder residue, the pristine condition of the chamber. This gun has not been fired recently, and yet our victim is quite dead. The room tensed. Lestrade's jaw tightened. Are you saying this isn't the murder weapon? I am saying, mon cher, that it is precisely what someone wishes us to believe. Poirot turned toward the others, his keen eyes scanning their faces. Someone placed it there deliberately, ensured that Monsieur Wentworth's fingerprints would be discovered upon it, and waited for you, Inspector, to find it and draw the obvious conclusion. Lady Blackwood scoffed. But that would mean the real killer is still among us. Poirot's gaze flickered toward her, unreadable. Mais oui, madame. Indeed, that is exactly what it means. Harriet folded her arms. So if Charles didn't do it, then who did? Poirot only smiled. Ah, mademoiselle, that is what we must still uncover. Lestrade let out an exasperated sigh. Poirot, you're making this far more complicated than it needs to be. Poirot shook his head. No, my friend. I am merely ensuring that we do not close the case prematurely. Lestrade hesitated, then grudgingly turned to Charles. For now, you remain in the house under watch, but don't think this clears you yet. Poirot gave a satisfied nod, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Someone had played their hand too soon, eager to cast blame in the wrong direction. But the true murderer, they were still watching, still waiting, and they had no intention of stopping. Now, as the evening deepened, Poirot sat in Lord Blackwood's study, his fingertips pressed together, eyes fixed on the revolver still resting on the desk. The candlelight flickered against the polished wood, casting long, restless shadows. There was something about this case, something elusive yet persistent, like a whisper in the dark. A single overlooked detail, a piece of the past resurfacing in the present. A gentle knock at the door disturbed his thoughts. Harriet peered in, her usual confidence tempered by hesitation. Monsieur Poirot, might I have a word? He gestured to the chair opposite him. But of course, mademoiselle. She sat, smoothing the folds of her dress, eyes flickering toward the revolver before returning to his face. You don't believe Charles killed my uncle, do you? Poirot inclined his head. I do not. Her shoulders sagged with relief. Then you must find out who did before it's too late. Too late for whom, mademoiselle? Poirot's gaze sharpened. She hesitated. For all of us. Blackwood Manor has never been free of ghosts, Monsieur Poirot. But I fear the past is catching up with us. Ah. Poirot leaned forward. Tell me, mademoiselle, what past do you speak of? Harriet exhaled, slowly her fingers twisting together. Did you know my uncle had a brother? Poirot's brows lifted. A brother? She nodded. His name was Reginald Blackwood. They were close once, but then something changed. No one speaks of it now, but I remember the way my uncle would tense at the mention of his name. He vanished years ago, left England without a word. Some say he was disowned, others that he chose exile. She swallowed. There was a fire in the east wing after he left. My uncle had it sealed off. No one has entered it since. Poirot tapped his fingers against the armrest. Curious, very curious. Harriet looked at him intently. You think it's connected, don't you? Poirot rose abruptly. Come, mademoiselle, we must see this east wing. She hesitated. Now? But it's been abandoned for years. All the more reason, Poirot murmured, already moving toward the door. With a lantern in hand, they ascended the winding staircase, their footsteps muffled by the thick dust lining the hall. The air grew heavier as they neared a set of double doors, their brass handles tarnished with time. Harriet hesitated before pushing them open. The room beyond was a forgotten relic, frozen in time. Furniture covered in sheets loomed like spectres, and the faint scent of charred wood lingered beneath layers of dust. Poirot's keen eyes swept the room, noting the cracked mirror, the scorched edges of the wallpaper, and a faint indentation in the floorboards near the fireplace. He crouched, brushing away the dust. A loose board. Carefully he lifted it, revealing a small metal box within. He retrieved it and examined the intricate monogram on the lid. R.B. Poirot opened the box. Inside lay a bundle of letters, their edges brittle with age. He unfolded the first one, his sharp gaze scanning the words, his lips pressed into a thin line. What is it? Harriet whispered. Poirot handed her the letter. She read aloud, voice trembling. My dear Edward, by the time you read this I will be gone. But know this, I have not forgotten what you did. Nor will I forgive. One day the truth will come for you, as surely as I have been cast aside. Beware the shadows, brother. They remember more than you think. Reginald Blackwood. Harriet's hand trembled. This was never meant to be found. Poirot's eyes gleamed. But it was, mademoiselle. And that changes everything. A noise from the hall made them both start. A soft creak, the sound of footsteps retreating. Poirot turned sharply, stepping toward the doorway, just as the lantern flickered. They were not alone. Poirot turned swiftly, his sharp gaze slicing through the dimly lit corridor beyond the east wing. The footsteps had been deliberate, not the hesitant shuffle of an aimless wanderer, but the careful retreat of someone who had been listening. He stepped into the hallway, his keen ears straining for the slightest sound, but silence had already swallowed whoever had been there. A shadowy observer, a guilty conscience. Harriet stood frozen in the doorway, gripping the letter as if it might disappear. "Who was that?" she whispered. Poirot pressed a finger to his lips, motioning for her to stay put. He stepped further into the corridor, his footsteps measured and quiet. The old manor's walls held their secrets tightly, but even the most careful of intruders left traces. A slight disturbance in the dust, the faintest scent of tobacco lingering in the air. Someone had been there. Someone had read Reginald Blackwood's final words along with them. Returning to Harriet, he took the letter from her trembling fingers and placed it back inside the metal box. "We must not reveal this discovery just yet, mademoiselle. There is a game to be played, and the next move must be ours. What do we do now?" she asked. Poirot's lips curved in a knowing smile. "Now we set the board and let the players reveal themselves." The next morning, the household was gathered in the drawing-room, the tension thick as the scent of fresh coffee. Charles sat stiffly in an armchair, his hands gripping the arms as if anchoring himself. Lady Blackwood perched on the edge of the chaise lounge, her usual poise slightly frayed. The other guests were scattered around, exchanging cautious glances, all aware that the detective had called for them, but none knew why. Poirot stood by the fireplace, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "Mes amis, it is often said that the past is best left undisturbed. But I have found that the past, like a restless ghost, refuses to remain buried." He let the words settle before continuing. "Last night I discovered something most intriguing in the East Wing." Lady Blackwood inhaled sharply. "The East Wing? But that part of the house has been closed for years." "Ah, oui, closed to most," Poirot agreed. "Yet someone was there, someone who listened when they should not have." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Charles shifted in his seat. "And what exactly did you find, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot's expression remained inscrutable. "A truth long forgotten. A truth about Reginald Blackwood." A murmur of surprise swept through the guests. Lady Blackwood paled. Reginald. What could he possibly have to do with this? Poirot tilted his head, observing her reaction. "You knew him well, did you not, madame?" She hesitated. "We all did, before he disappeared." Poirot stepped forward, his gaze sweeping the room. "But let us speak not of Reginald, but of the living. You see, mon ami Hastings once told me that the mind, when confronted with an unexpected truth, betrays itself. I believe this is true. And so, I must conduct a little experiment." His hand disappeared into his pocket, and when it emerged, he held a folded piece of parchment. "Inside this envelope is a detail from the past, something that only the person involved in Lord Blackwood's murder would recognize." He set the envelope on the table. "I will leave it here, untouched, and we shall continue our conversation." A silence fell over the room. No one moved. Poirot sat down, crossing his legs. "Let us discuss something else, yes. The weather, perhaps. It is said that storms bring out confessions." The tension stretched, the weight of the envelope pressing on the minds of everyone present. Poirot's gaze flickered between them, noting every shift in posture, every stolen glance. The human mind was a marvelous thing, but under pressure it cracked in the most revealing ways. Minutes passed. The guests tried to feign indifference, but the envelope remained a silent accusation. On the table, Poirot observed, waiting. Then, ever so slightly, a single glance betrayed everything. It was not Charles nor Lady Blackwood, but Mr. Whittaker, the solicitor, a flicker of recognition, a twitch of the fingers, a rapid blinking of the eyes before. He caught himself. Poirot watched as the man clasped his hands together, forcing himself into stillness. Poirot smiled. The crack had appeared. "Interesting," he murmured. He stood retrieving the envelope. Curious, is it not? How silence often speaks the loudest. He tapped the parchment against his palm. I believe I have my next lead. Whitaker swallowed, his usual composure fraying at the edges. Poirot turned to him with a knowing glance. "Would you care for a private conversation, monsieur?" Poirot kept his gaze steady on Whitaker, noting the way his fingers twitched against his knee, the subtle shifting of his shoulders, as if he were bracing for an impact he could not predict. The man cleared his throat, composing himself, but Poirot had already seen the momentary lapse, the unguarded instant when a guilty conscience flickered through his features. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot," Whitaker said smoothly, though his voice carried an artificial ease. "If you believe I can be of assistance." Poirot gestured toward the study, and Whitaker rose, dusting imaginary lint from his sleeve before following. The door closed behind them, sealing them within the quiet, book-lined room. Poirot did not sit. Instead, he moved toward the fireplace, his fingers tracing the mantel absent-mindedly as he spoke. "Monsieur Whitaker, you have been Lord Blackwood's solicitor for many years, have you not?" Whitaker adjusted his cuffs. "That is correct. And in such a position, you would have known much about his affairs. His will, his estate, his business dealings." "Yes," Whitaker said carefully. "That is my role." Poirot turned, his sharp gaze catching the flicker of unease Whitaker tried to suppress. "Then you would also have known of any outstanding debts, hidden transactions, or perhaps—" Poirot let the words linger before delivering the strike. "An old scandal that someone would rather keep buried." Whitaker's jaw tensed. "I don't know what you mean." Poirot took a step closer. "Oh, but I think you do. You see, last night someone was in the East Wing, someone who overheard something they should not have." He tilted his head. "And today, when I presented my little experiment, there was only one person in this household who reacted before they had time to think." Whitaker hesitated, then scoffed lightly. "You're grasping at shadows, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot smiled. "Perhaps. Or perhaps the shadows are growing shorter, and soon there will be nowhere left to hide." A sharp knock at the door interrupted them, followed by the hurried entrance of Hastings, his face tight with urgency. "Poirot, there's been a break-in." Poirot's expression darkened. "Where?" "The East Wing." Whitaker exhaled slowly, turning away as if to hide the relief flickering across his face. Poirot caught it nonetheless. He strode past Hastings, making his way through the corridors, each step measured yet brisk. As he entered the East Wing, his suspicions crystallized. The small metal box where the letter had been stored lay on the floor, its lid pried open. The letter inside, gone. Harriet stood near the door, pale with shock. "I only left for a moment," she said. "I heard something, but by the time I returned it was too late." Poirot knelt, examining the box. The lock had not been forced. With brute strength, but picked with precision, a professional hand. He turned his attention to the window. No sign of forced entry. The culprit had come from inside. Someone in this house was growing desperate. Lady Blackwood appeared in the doorway, her eyes narrowing at the scene. "What's happened?" Poirot straightened. "A theft, madame. A most deliberate one." Pressed a hand to her throat. "What was stolen?" Poirot studied her carefully. A letter, one that could change everything. A flicker of something crossed her face, alarm perhaps, but she recovered swiftly. "Do you know who took it?" Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. Not yet. But consider this, madame. Whoever stole it knew precisely where to look and precisely when to act. That suggests they were either very lucky— He let the words hang in the air before finishing, or very well informed. A heavy silence settled over the room. Harriet's voice was small but firm. Then we have a traitor among us. Poirot nodded gravely. And they are willing to go to great lengths to keep the truth buried. The air in the east wing was thick with unease. The stolen letter had shifted everything, drawing unseen hands into motion. Yet Poirot knew that desperation often bred mistakes. Whoever had taken it had acted swiftly, too swiftly, as if fearing what might come next. Before he could dwell further, a sharp cry echoed from the corridor. Poirot turned abruptly, Hastings already moving ahead of him toward the source. They found Harriet in the hallway, trembling, her hand pressed against the wall for support. "What is it?" Poirot asked, stepping closer. Harriet pointed with a shaking hand. "It's Lady Blackwood," she whispered. She collapsed. They rushed into the drawing room, where Lady Blackwood lay sprawled across the settee, her breathing shallow, her complexion an ashen grey. Her teacup had toppled onto the floor, its contents pooling against the polished wood. Poirot's sharp eyes immediately flickered toward the cup, then back to Lady Blackwood. "A poisoning! Fetch the doctor," he ordered. Hastings sprinted off. Poirot knelt beside Lady Blackwood, pressing 2 fingers lightly to her wrist. Her pulse was erratic, but present. Her eyelids fluttered as she attempted to focus on him. "Madame," he said gently, "what happened?" Her lips parted, but only a faint breath escaped. Poirot leaned in. "The letter," she whispered, barely audible. "They won't stop." Her body tensed as a wave of pain overtook her, and then she fell unconscious. Poirot straightened, his mind racing. This was no coincidence. The theft of the letter and the sudden attack on Lady Blackwood, they were connected. Someone in this house was willing to do whatever it took to keep their secret buried. Harriet hovered nearby, her face pale. Who would do this? Poirot studied her carefully. That, mademoiselle, is the question we must answer before they strike again. Hastings returned with Dr. Langley, who wasted no time examining Lady Blackwood. "Poison," he muttered under his breath. "Not a fatal dose, but enough to incapacitate her." He looked at Poirot. Whatever she drank was laced with something strong. Poirot's gaze flickered to the tea, then to the silver tray where it had been served. The pot remained half full. A single cup had been poured. "Who prepared this tea?" Poirot asked. Harriet's voice was hesitant. "The butler." As always, Poirot turned to the doorway. "Then it is time we had a word with him." Moments later, Mr. Graves, the ever-composed butler, stood before Poirot, hands clasped neatly in front of him. "You served Lady Blackwood's tea?" Poirot asked. "Yes, sir, as I do every evening." "Did anyone else have access to it before?" "She drank." The butler's expression did not waver. "No one." Poirot studied him, considering the possibilities. Was he lying, or had the poison been introduced before the tea ever reached his hands? A soft groan from the settee turned all. Eyes back to Lady Blackwood. She was stirring, her eyelids fluttering open as she struggled to regain full consciousness. Poirot stepped closer. "Madame," he said gently, "can you tell us? Did you see anything? Did you notice anything unusual before you drank the tea?" She blinked sluggishly, then her expression flickered with something. Realization then. Fear. Not before, she murmured. After. Poirot leaned in. After. Her fingers weakly gripped the edge of the settee. I saw him, she whispered. Outside the window. A chill passed through the room. Who, madame? Poirot. Pressed. Her breath was uneven. Blackwood. A stunned silence followed. Hastings stammered. But Blackwood is dead. Poirot straightened, his mind already spinning through the implications. Had Lady Blackwood, in her weakened state, imagined it? Or had someone taken great pains to ensure she saw exactly what they wanted her to? One thing was certain. This was no longer a case of simple murder. Someone was orchestrating a game far more elaborate than anyone had anticipated, and Poirot had no doubt. They were running out of time. Poirot remained still, his sharp gaze locked on Lady Blackwood. The room held its breath, the weight of her, words lingering. Had she truly seen Lord Blackwood? Or had the flickering candlelight and the stress of the moment played tricks on her fragile mind? He could not dismiss the possibility that someone had orchestrated this vision deliberately, planting the idea like a seed of doubt meant to unravel her completely. Hastings shifted uneasily beside him. Poirot, he murmured. It's impossible. Blackwood's been dead for months. Poirot nodded slightly, but said nothing. He turned back to Lady Blackwood. Madame, he said gently, where did you see him? Her breathing was still uneven. Outside, by the garden arch. He was standing there, watching. Poirot followed her gaze toward the window. The heavy curtains had been drawn apart just enough to offer a view of the moonlit garden. The arch she spoke of stood near the stone pathway, half obscured by creeping vines. At this hour, anyone lurking in the shadows would have been a mere silhouette, their features distorted by the flickering lamps. He moved toward the window and peered outside. The night was quiet, the wind barely stirring the leaves. There were no footsteps in the damp soil, no sign of a presence. But Poirot knew better than to expect a clumsy adversary. If someone had been there, they had planned their movements carefully. He turned back to the room, his gaze sweeping across its occupants. Harriet stood near the fireplace, pale but composed, her fingers still pressed against her lips. The butler, Mr. Graves, remained near the door, his expression unreadable. Dr. Langley was rechecking Lady Blackwood's pulse, his features taut with concern. A thought flickered in Poirot's mind. A pattern. Something was beginning to take shape, though it remained just beyond his grasp. He replayed the sequence of events, the stolen letter, the poisoned tea, the vision outside the window. Was it a coincidence that these incidents had unfolded in such quick succession? Or was someone tightening their grip, forcing the investigation down a particular path? His gaze flickered to the overturned teacup. The poison had not been fatal, only strong enough to weaken Lady Blackwood, to make her vulnerable, and at the precise moment when she was at her most fragile, she had seen Lord Blackwood. A calculated sequence. Someone had wanted her to believe in ghosts. Poirot turned abruptly. Mr. Graves, he said. Who else was near the tea before? It was served. The butler stiffened. No one, sir. No one at all. Poirot's voice was mild, but his gaze was unwavering. Graves hesitated. Except for the maid, Alice, who assisted in setting the tray. Poirot glanced at Hastings. We must speak with her. A few minutes later, Alice was brought in, her fingers twisting nervously in her apron. She was young, no older than 20, with wide, frightened eyes. Monsieur Poirot, she stammered. Have I done something wrong? Not at all, mademoiselle, Poirot reassured her. I simply wished to know, when you prepared the tea, did anything seem unusual? Alice frowned, thinking, not unusual, sir, but... She hesitated. Go on. Well, Lady Blackwood's tea is always served from the second pot on the tray, but tonight the pots were switched. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. Switched? Yes, sir. I noticed it just as I was about to bring the tray, but I assumed Mr. Graves had arranged it that way. Poirot turned back to the butler. Did you, Mr. Graves? Graves's mouth pressed into a thin line. No, sir. The order is never changed. A pause stretched between them. Someone had deliberately altered the placement, ensuring Lady Blackwood received the poisoned tea. But why? If the intent was to kill, the dose had been too low, which meant it was never meant to kill her, only to frighten her. Poirot folded, his hands behind his back, stepping away as his mind sifted through the details. The theft of the letter, the poisoning, the vision outside, it all pointed to a carefully constructed illusion meant to drive Lady Blackwood into a state of paranoia. Someone wanted her to doubt her own reality. Someone wanted to manipulate her fear. Then it came. A single thread connecting everything. The letter. It had been stolen before she could read it. But what if the contents had revealed something damning? Something that would have unraveled the entire deception? The timing was too precise to be chance. The letter had been removed to control the narrative. Poirot's gaze flickered back to Lady Blackwood. Madam, do you recall anything about the letter before it disappeared? She pressed a hand to her forehead. It was from an old friend of my husband's, someone he had known for years. Poirot's pulse quickened. Do you remember the name? A long silence. Then, barely above a whisper, Jonathan Marsh. Hastings let out a low whistle. Marsh? Wasn't he a business partner of Lord Blackwood? Poirot finished. One who vanished after Blackwood's death. The pattern locked into place. Whoever had taken the letter had known its significance, had known that Jonathan Marsh held the key to the truth. And now they were doing everything in their power to make sure that truth never surfaced. Poirot straightened. The game had changed, and this time he would not be the one left in the dark. Poirot stood motionless, his sharp mind weaving through the tangled threads of deception. Jonathan Marsh, a name that had been carefully erased from the investigation until now. But why? What did he know that warranted such an elaborate scheme? Poisoned tea, stolen letters, and a ghostly apparition designed to push Lady Blackwood to the brink. The answer was near, tantalizingly close, and yet still shrouded in shadow. Hastings exhaled, his brow furrowed. Poirot, if Marsh truly has the answers, then we need to find him before our culprit does. Poirot turned to Lady Blackwood, his expression unreadable. Madame, when was the last time you heard from Monsieur Marsh before this letter arrived? She hesitated. Not since my husband's death. He disappeared, as if he had no desire to be found. And yet he resurfaces now. Why? Poirot's gaze intensified. Non. The question is not merely why he wrote to you. It is why someone feared what he had to say. The room remained silent, heavy with anticipation. Poirot paced, his shoes clicking softly against the polished floor. Then, with a sudden movement, he turned to the butler. Mr. Graves, When exactly did the letter go missing? The butler's face remained impassive. It was on the drawing-room table after the afternoon post was sorted. When Lady Blackwood went to read it after dinner, it was gone. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. Which means it was stolen during dinner. And yet no one in this household was seen taking it. Harriet, who had remained quiet until now, spoke hesitantly. Couldn't an outsider have taken it? Perhaps someone sneaked in from the garden? Poirot shook his head. No, mademoiselle. The house was locked for the night. Whoever took that letter was already inside. Harriet's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Poirot's eyes flickered toward Lady Blackwood. Madame, think carefully. Did your husband ever mention Jonathan Marsh in connection to something unusual? Her fingers tightened around the armrest of her chair. Only once. He said Marsh had warned him about a terrible mistake. A mistake he'd soon regret. A hush fell over the room. Poirot's mind sharpened, cutting through the remaining uncertainty. Lord Blackwood's death had always been assumed to be a tragic accident. A fall down the marble staircase late at night. But what if it had not been an accident at all? Poirot turned abruptly to Hastings. We must locate Marsh at once. They had little to go on, no address, no recent records. But Poirot had encountered ghosts before, and he knew that even those who wished to remain hidden always left traces. A single inquiry at the telegraph office revealed that a letter had been posted from an inn just outside the city. Poirot and Hastings wasted no time, arriving at the modest establishment under the cover of night. The innkeeper, an elderly woman, with sharp eyes, studied Poirot carefully as he inquired about Marsh. A gentleman by that name was here, she admitted finally. Stayed for 2 nights, left early this morning. Poirot's lips pressed into a thin line. Did he say where he was going? She hesitated. No, but he seemed troubled, kept looking over his shoulder. Poirot nodded, sliding a few coins across the counter. And did he receive any visitors? The woman hesitated, then lowered her voice. A man came last night, tall, stern-looking, wore gloves even indoors. Poirot's pulse quickened. Did you hear their conversation? She shook her head. They spoke in hushed tones, but when the visitor left, Mr. Marsh locked his door and didn't come out till morning. Poirot exchanged a glance with Hastings. The stolen letter, the poisoning, the staged ghost. None of it had been random. Someone had been closing in on Marsh, ensuring that his secrets never surfaced. And now, Marsh had fled. As they stepped back into the cold night air, Poirot exhaled slowly. Mon ami, he murmured, we are no longer dealing with a simple crime of greed or revenge. There is something much darker at play. Hastings frowned. What do you mean? Poirot's gaze was distant, his mind piecing together the final puzzle. Lord Blackwood did not die by accident. He was murdered. Hastings stiffened. But there was no evidence. None. Because it was a crime designed to leave no trace. Poirot's voice was grim. And Jonathan Marsh, the only man who knew the truth, has now disappeared. A silence settled between them, heavy with the weight of the revelation. Poirot straightened his coat. We must find him before his fate is sealed. And with that, they stepped into the darkness, the chase beginning anew. The night was thick with fog as Poirot and Hastings made their way back to Blackwood Manor. The weight of the truth pressed upon them. Lord Blackwood had been murdered, and Jonathan Marsh had held the key to it all. But with Marsh vanished, the danger was more present than ever. Whoever had silenced Blackwood was still out there, ensuring their secrets remained buried. Poirot's mind was racing, every detail fitting together into an intricate design. The missing letter, the staged haunting, the poisoning, and now a man on the run. But one question remained: who had orchestrated it all, and why? As the manor loomed before them, Poirot's footsteps quickened. He had no intention of waiting for answers to come to him. It was time to set the trap. Inside, Lady Blackwood sat by the fireplace, her fingers wrapped tightly around a cup of tea. Her eyes lifted as Poirot entered, a flicker of apprehension crossing her face. Harriet stood nearby, tense and watchful. Mr. Graves, as always, remained impassive, his hands folded neatly in front of him. Poirot's sharp gaze swept over them all. "Madam," he said smoothly, "I must ask, was there anyone your husband feared in his final days? Someone he avoided?" Lady Blackwood's fingers twitched slightly. "He had many associates, Monsieur Poirot. But fear? No. He was not a man easily frightened." Poirot tilted his head. "And yet he was warned." The silence in the room deepened. Harriet shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Graves remained still. Poirot continued, his voice low and measured. "Monsieur Marsh wrote to you because he knew the truth, and now he is missing. But before he disappeared, he received a visitor, a man in gloves." A flicker of recognition passed over Lady Blackwood's face, almost too quick to catch. Poirot's eyes locked onto her. "Who was he?" She hesitated, her composure faltering for the briefest moment. Then quietly she said, "My husband's lawyer, Mr. Aldous Finch." Hastings straightened. "The lawyer? What business would he have with Marsh?" Poirot's mind was already moving ahead. Perhaps the same business that involved rewriting Lord Blackwood's will days before his death. The air in the room turned electric. Poirot's voice remained calm. "You see, mes amis, this crime, it was never about revenge or a personal vendetta. No, it was something far simpler." He turned to Lady Blackwood, his gaze piercing. "It was about wealth, power, and ensuring that no one stood in the way of it." She inhaled sharply. "You think I—" "Non, madame, I do not believe you orchestrated this, but someone close to you did. Someone who stood to gain everything if Lord Blackwood met an untimely end." His eyes flickered toward Harriet. She tensed. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Poirot's voice was eerily soft. "The staged ghost, the poisoned tea, the missing letter. Each event designed to instill fear, to distract. But fear is a weapon only when it serves a purpose, and in this case the purpose was simple. Lady Blackwood was to be deemed unwell, incapable of managing her late husband's affairs." Lady Blackwood's eyes widened. Poirot turned fully toward Harriet now. "And once she was removed, who would oversee the estate?" Harriet's jaw tightened. "That's absurd." "No, mademoiselle." Poirot's voice sharpened. "It is the truth." A sudden movement. Harriet reached into the folds of her dress, her fingers closing around something. Poirot's hand shot out. "I would not do that." She froze. Hastings stepped forward, and the glint of metal caught the firelight. Harriet had drawn a small, elegant dagger. Her breaths came fast, her eyes darting toward the door. Poirot shook his head. There is nowhere to run. The silence stretched. And then, something in Harriet's face changed. The composure cracked, giving way to something raw. Her grip loosened, and the dagger clattered to the floor. She exhaled shakily. You weren't supposed to figure it out. Poirot stepped closer. But I did, mademoiselle, because the truth, it always finds its way through. Her gaze flickered to Lady Blackwood. I didn't want to hurt you. I only wanted what was owed to me. Lady Blackwood's voice was barely a whisper. You were like a daughter to me. Harriet looked away, her face unreadable. Poirot let the silence settle before speaking again, his voice firm. The authorities will take it from here. The night was far from over, but the case had reached its end. The truth had been laid bare, the secrets unravelled, and as the storm outside raged on, Poirot knew justice had finally caught up. Poirot watched as Harriet sat, her hands trembling, her gaze fixed on the floor. The fire crackled in the dimly lit room, shadows flickering against the walls of Blackwood Manor. The air was thick with the weight of revelation, but something gnawed at him, a quiet, persistent unease that refused to settle. Hastings, ever the loyal companion, let out a breath of relief. Well, Poirot, I must say, that was rather intense, but it's done now, isn't it? Harriet's confession, the motive, it all makes sense. Poirot didn't respond immediately. His keen eyes were still studying Harriet. Something about her confession, her final words, did not align. She had said, I only wanted what was owed to me. A strange choice of words. Not what I deserved, not what I wished for, but what was owed to me. Poirot's gaze flickered to Lady Blackwood, who sat rigidly in her chair. She had barely spoken since Harriet's admission. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. Mademoiselle Harriet, Poirot finally said, his voice quiet but firm. Who told you that something was owed to you? Harriet's head snapped up, confusion flashing across her face. What? You orchestrated much, oui, the haunting, the staged poisoning, the fear, but murder, non. Poirot's voice sharpened. You are clever, mademoiselle, but you are not ruthless. You did not kill Lord Blackwood. A sharp inhale from Hastings. The others in the room stiffened. Harriet's lips parted, but no words came. Poirot's attention shifted. Lady Blackwood. The woman flinched ever so slightly. Poirot took a step forward. It was you, wasn't it? A gasp from Hastings. Harriet turned, eyes wide. That's ridiculous, she whispered. She wouldn't. Poirot's voice did not waver. And yet, she did. He turned toward Lady Blackwood fully now, his eyes unwavering. Your husband changed his will just before his death. He was planning something you could not allow. Harriet, I believe, was meant to be the distraction. But the true crime, the murder itself, was committed by you. Lady Blackwood's fingers curled tightly around the fabric of her dress. A long silence followed. Then, very softly, she spoke. You are mistaken, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot shook his head. Am I? His voice was like steel. Your husband planned to leave nearly everything to a single beneficiary, someone unexpected, someone who would have overturned everything. He turned to Harriet. Tell me, mademoiselle, why did you believe something was owed to you? Harriet swallowed hard. Because... She hesitated, then whispered, because Lord Blackwood was my father. A stunned silence. Hastings took a sharp step back. Good Lord. Poirot's voice remained steady. That is what you were told, was it not? Harriet's eyes were wide. Yes. Poirot exhaled slowly. Then tell me, mademoiselle, where is the proof? Harriet stilled. The birth records, the letters, anything confirming your claim? Poirot pressed. You were given this information, yes, but were you ever shown the truth? Harriet's face drained of colour. Poirot's voice was barely above a whisper now. Because the truth was a fabrication, a carefully planted lie. Your connection to Lord Blackwood was never real. But you believed it, because you were meant to. Poirot turned back to Lady Blackwood. And that is why you killed him. N'est-ce pas? You could not allow his fortune to go to a girl who had no true claim. But more than that, you could not allow him to leave you with nothing. Lady Blackwood remained still. Her hands, once trembling, steadied. Then, at last, she spoke. You are very perceptive, Monsieur Poirot. A chill swept through the room. She stood slowly, her posture regal, her expression unreadable. My husband was a fool, she said softly. He wanted to make amends for a past that never existed. He believed he had wronged a woman long ago, and that Harriet was his daughter. But he was mistaken. I knew the truth. Her eyes darkened. I showed him proof. Documents that confirmed Harriet's mother had deceived him. He refused to believe me. She took a slow step forward. So I took matters into my own hands. Poirot watched her carefully. You poisoned him? A small, chilling smile. Yes. Harriet let out a sharp breath, stepping back as if struck. Lady Blackwood's voice was calm. He had lost his mind, Monsieur Poirot. He would have given everything away based on a lie. He needed to be stopped. Poirot shook his head. And what of the haunting, the stage terror? Did you truly believe that Harriet would crumble under fear? Lady Blackwood's expression hardened. Harriet was never my concern. I allowed her to believe she was at the centre of it all. I knew she would act rashly, desperately. I knew it would create chaos. And I knew, in the end, she would take the fall. The weight of her words settled like a stone in the air. Poirot nodded slowly. But you did not account for one thing, madame. Her eyes flickered. Poirot's voice was quiet but resolute. The truth always has a way of surfacing. At that moment, the front door burst open. 2 officers stepped in, their faces set in grim determination. Poirot did not need to speak. Lady Blackwood had already confessed. She exhaled, turning, her gaze toward them. Very well, she murmured. It appears this game is over. She did not resist as they took her away. Harriet remained still, her breathing shallow. Poirot turned to her. You were deceived, mademoiselle. But now, you are free from the weight of that deception. Harriet swallowed hard, nodding once. As the officers led Lady Blackwood away, the fire crackled once more, filling the silence. Poirot straightened his cuffs, exhaling softly. It is finished. As the heavy doors of Blackwood Manor swung shut, behind the departing officers, an uneasy stillness settled over the room. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting shifting shadows along the grand walls. Harriet remained motionless in her chair, her fingers curled tightly against the fabric of her dress. The weight of everything, her own deception, Lady Blackwood's, ruthlessness, the truth of her supposed lineage, pressed down upon her. Hastings finally exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Well, Poirot, I must say that was extraordinary. But tell me, was there ever a moment when you weren't certain? When you thought perhaps Harriet had done it after all?" Poirot's moustache twitched ever so slightly as he turned toward his friend. "Ah, mon ami, certainty is never a thing to be assumed too quickly. One must always allow room for the truth to breathe." He stepped forward, his shoes clicking lightly against the wooden floor. "You ask if I doubted Mademoiselle Harriet? Oui, for a moment. She had every reason to feel betrayed. And the acts she committed, the hauntings, the sabotage, were cunning. But they lacked the one thing that true murder demands." Hastings frowned. "And that is?" Poirot turned to Harriet now, his expression softer. "The capacity for it." Harriet swallowed, her voice small. "I thought I hated him. I thought he had abandoned my mother and owed me everything. But now—" Her voice trailed off, her hands clenching as if trying to grasp something intangible. "Now I don't even know who I am." Poirot nodded gently. "You are not alone in this, mademoiselle. It is difficult when one's identity is built upon a falsehood, but you are not the one who took a life in cold blood. That is what matters now." Hastings gave a tight nod. "Yes, and Lady Blackwood will pay for what she's done. There's no escaping justice now." Poirot's gaze flickered toward the window where the night stretched out in silent vastness. He said nothing for a moment, his expression unreadable. Harriet noticed it first. "What is it?" Poirot let out a slow breath, his fingers coming together in a delicate steeple. "I have solved many cases, mes amis, and I have seen justice take many forms. But there is one thing I have learned over the years." His voice was quiet now, deliberate. "Justice is not always swift, nor is it always absolute." A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. The butler, his face pale and uncertain, stepped forward. "Sir, a message has just arrived." Poirot took the note, his fingers unfolding. The parchment carefully. His eyes scanned the words. Then, without a word, he handed it to Hastings. Hastings frowned as he read aloud. "The prisoner has escaped en route to the station. Search is underway. We'll send further updates." A stunned silence. Harriet sat upright. "She escaped?" Poirot exhaled sharply through his nose. "As I feared." Hastings looked utterly bewildered. "But how, Poirot? She was in police custody, surrounded by officers." Poirot turned toward the window again, his sharp eyes lost in thought. "Lady Blackwood is many things, mon ami. A murderer, a manipulator, but also a woman of immense cunning. She has spent years mastering the art of deception. Do you truly think she did not anticipate this moment?" Harriet's voice was barely above a whisper. "You mean she planned this?" Poirot turned back to them. "Mais oui, from the very beginning." Hastings stared. "But you exposed her, Poirot. She confessed. What more could she do?" Poirot shook his head. "Confession is not always defeat, my friend. It can be a means to an end." Hastings furrowed his brow. "I don't follow." Poirot stepped closer, his voice low but insistent. "Think, Hastings. Lady Blackwood knew the walls were closing in. She knew that once I saw through her ruse, she could not escape her guilt. But what if she already had an escape route prepared?" Harriet's breath hitched. "The Carriage. Poirot nodded. Exactement. The officers were prepared for a prisoner, but they were not prepared for her. A woman who has lived her entire life among deception and artifice. A woman who, I suspect, had planned for this very moment long before I even stepped foot in this manor. Hastings let out a slow breath. Good Lord. She knew she wouldn't make it to trial. Poirot tapped a finger against his temple. She had only one choice, to disappear, and that, mon ami, is precisely what she has done. The silence that followed was heavy, the implications settling into the air like dust. Harriet was the first to speak. So, what now? If she's gone, does that mean she's won? Poirot turned to her, his expression unreadable. Non, mademoiselle. A murderer does not simply win. His voice lowered. But she has ensured that justice will not come easily. Hastings ran a hand through his hair. This is madness, Poirot. Can't we do anything? Poirot nodded. We will. The search will continue. She has made herself a fugitive, and that is no small burden to bear. But Lady Blackwood is dangerous, and she will not remain in the shadows forever. She will make a mistake. She will seek something she believes she has lost. And when she does, his eyes darkened. I will be waiting. Harriet's voice was quiet. Do you think we'll ever see her again? Poirot's gaze remained fixed on the night beyond the window. The wind howled softly, as if whispering an answer neither of them wished to hear. At last, he murmured, One way or another, mademoiselle, I am certain of it. The wind carried a distant echo through the empty halls of Blackwood Manor. Poirot stood by the window, his silhouette framed against the moonlit sky. Hastings paced behind him, glancing occasionally at Harriet, who sat quietly by the dying fire, lost in thought. The escape of Lady Blackwood hung over them like a shadow, an unresolved whisper of danger that refused to be silenced. Hastings sighed, shaking his head. I still can't believe it, Poirot. How does someone vanish like that? She was in police custody, under watch. Poirot turned slightly, his expression unreadable. Ah, mon ami, it is not a question of how, but when. She has had years to perfect the art of deception. This was never an act of desperation, it was a calculated move. Harriet finally spoke, her voice distant. She'll come back, won't she? Poirot studied her for a long moment before answering. A person like Lady Blackwood does not simply disappear into obscurity. Non. She will find her way back into the world, into power, but she will not be the same. She will be hunted. She will be watched, and sooner or later, she will make a mistake. Hastings folded his arms. And when she does? Poirot's lips curled slightly, though there was no real satisfaction in his expression. We will be ready. Silence settled over them, heavy with unfinished business. The case was solved, at least in the way the world would see it. The papers would report the crime, the confession, and the shocking escape. The hunt for Lady Blackwood would become a story of its own, stretching beyond their reach. But Poirot was not at ease. There was something else. A whisper at the back of his mind. A thread he had yet to pull. He turned, his sharp eyes sweeping over the room. It was almost instinctual, the way he searched, the way he listened for the details others might overlook. And then, as his gaze settled on the grand fireplace, something flickered in his mind. A memory. A moment from the night before. Harriet had been by the fire, lost in thought. The flames had burned low, their light dancing over the old stone. Poirot remembered it vividly now, the way she had reached out absently, brushing her fingers against the mantelpiece. The way her touch had hesitated just for a second. Poirot stepped forward, his movements deliberate. Hastings watched him curiously, but did not interrupt. Harriet barely reacted as Poirot's fingers ran along the edge of the mantelpiece, feeling for something unseen, and then, click. A faint mechanical sound. Hastings took a step closer. "What is it, Poirot?" Poirot said nothing. Instead, he pressed further, feeling the hidden latch give way beneath his touch. A section of the stone shifted. The fire crackled as if in response, its glow revealing a hollow space within the wall. A compartment. Harriet inhaled sharply. Slowly, Poirot reached inside and withdrew a small, aged envelope. It was brittle at the edges, sealed with an ornate wax crest, one Hastings recognized instantly, the Blackwood crest. His voice was hushed. Poirot studied the seal before carefully breaking it. The parchment inside was old, its ink slightly faded but still legible. As he unfolded it, his eyes moved swiftly across the words. Then he stopped. Hastings saw the shift in his expression, the rare moment when even Poirot, with all his certainty, was taken aback. "What does it say?" Harriet asked, her voice barely. Above a whisper, Poirot's fingers tightened around the parchment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, measured. "It is a letter," he murmured. "Written many years ago." He glanced up, meeting Harriet's gaze. "By your mother?" Harriet paled. "My mother." Poirot nodded, his expression grave. "Addressed to Lord Blackwood, it speaks of secrets, of truths hidden in the depths of this house, and of something else." He hesitated. A warning. Hastings felt a chill run through him. "A warning?" Poirot turned back to the letter, his voice unreadable as he read aloud. "If you betray me, if you cast aside your own blood, the truth will find you. The sins of the past will not stay buried forever. And one day, when the walls of Blackwood crumble, you will know that you have been judged." Silence. Harriet's hands trembled. "She knew," she whispered. "She knew he would abandon her." Poirot carefully folded the letter. "Your mother understood far more than anyone gave her credit for." Hastings shook his head. "But what does it mean, Poirot? The walls of Blackwood crumbling? The truth finding him? Is it just poetic, or—" Poirot exhaled slowly, his eyes scanning the room as if seeing it anew. "Perhaps it is nothing more than a woman's final warning, but—" He glanced at Harriet. "Or perhaps, mademoiselle, the mystery of Blackwood Manor is not yet finished." A new weight settled in the air. The case was closed, the crime solved, and yet the feeling lingered that something had been set in motion, something neither Poirot nor Hastings could fully see. Harriet swallowed hard, glancing toward the fireplace, where the hidden compartment now lay exposed. If my mother knew the truth, if she left this letter behind, what else did she leave? Poirot offered a small, knowing smile. "Ah, mademoiselle, that is a question only time can answer." As the firelight flickered, casting long shadows, across the room, Poirot turned toward the door. Hastings followed, glancing once more at the letter in Poirot's hand. The past had spoken, but had it said everything? As they stepped into the night, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a quiet, lingering promise. A mystery never truly ends. It simply waits.